All right. Okay, guys, so we said last week that part of our definition of a martial art is that it is a reflection of the philosophy and belief systems of the parent culture, and that's the main topic for today, is those philosophical and religious aspects. And though we recognize that what Webster, in his definition, was wrong in saying that all martial arts originated in Asia, today we will be focusing mostly on the Asian examples of religion and in the martial arts, okay? Because Asia is the home of several different doctrines that affected the martial arts. And secondly, I think we have to realize that nowhere else in the world were the two concepts of combat and religion, which a lot of people would say would be kind of unreconcilable, but probably more intricately related in Asia than anywhere else. And that's not to say you hear about, kind of the chivalry code that was out of, Christian and the Knights of Templar and later the concept of muscular Christianity. So there were similar ideas in the West and things like that. Don't get me wrong, okay? But you could make the argument that the symbiosis reached its heights in Asia, not seen elsewhere. And for that reason, Asia presents probably the best examples of how religion and martial arts were tied together. Now, having said that, you might have heard the phrase, there are no atheists in foxholes, right? So, as I said, we're looking in Asia, but it is a very common trend to tie, when we are talking about warfare, and there is very much an element of chance to it. I mean, you're on the battlefield, there's a stray arrow can land, it could be, you're unlucky and you're standing in the place where that arrow lands, no one's like, actually, there is a lot more element of chance, right? Where you step or whatever so you see, if you look at Vietnam footage, right, you see, GIs that are, as helicopters are taking off, they're taking canteen water and they're crossing it like it's holy water on the blessing the helicopter. I'm pretty sure that canteen water was not really holy water, right? But, or, certainly a lot of soldiers would wear, religious trinkets into rosary beads or lucky, or even rabbit's feet, right? It doesn't always have to be religious. But when we're talking about, there's always that element of chance on something that is so important as life and death, it is pretty natural to want to seek supernatural intervention, good luck, something else on your side, right? So as the saying goes, there are no atheists in foxholes, right? So this is a very natural trend around the world, okay? So it's not just specific for that. Now, there's also a strong argument to be made that really all of this is really kind of much to do about nothing or after the fact. And what I mean by that is, martial arts has prescribed or tied in some of these philosophical elements or whatever else. And so we're going to talk about, for example, Taoism here in a minute and how it influenced the internal martial arts. One of those internal martial arts is called Xingyi, right? Xingyi was developed by a famous general who was famous for staff work, okay? Now, he had an army. He had to make them proficient with the weapon. Or if you were a professional, if you were a martial arts master in olden times, you were military, you were bodyguard, a lot what we would consider more private security now. You were, you guarded, you helped someone, travel across the country or from one city to another or something like that. Okay. So, hey, we're still recording though. That's good. Okay. So, basically, there we are. So Sorry, guys. Those of you guys that are going to be watching at home. Okay. So, if your life depended on this, if your livelihood and therefore your life also depended on the use of this martial arts, do you care if it was like, well, I only want to study an art that, you know, teaches, that is in line with the way of the universe, blah, 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 or, you know, do you care what the spiritual or philosophical overtones of the martial art is, or does you just want it to save your bacon? Right. So there is a large component of this that, or a lot of people would make the argument that a lot of what we are talking about, honestly, is kind of we put the importance on these things after the fact. And, you know, now, if you were Taoist and you had a particular way of looking at the world, and, you know, what is the proper way of things going about doing things or whatever, then as you made a martial art, that very well might have influenced how you made your martial art as you look at things, right? So it influenced maybe how you develop a martial art. But did they really start out and go, I must do a martial art that is true with the way of my, you know, or whatever? You know, again, so how much was this, how much of this is martial arts being influenced in its development, and how much of this is us basically taking what we know about religion and influencing the or kind of ascribing meaning to the martial arts after the fact. Okay? Nevertheless, we're going to do it. All right? Now, when going through the religions and their impact, you might find that some of these contributions can be attributed to like more than one religion, or to a number of different martial arts, and there's a couple reasons. One, we're never really going to probably know. It's really impossible to tell which one was the true influencer and things like that. So we want to recognize all the possibilities. But second is you got to understand in Asia, there's been Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, other religions that have coexisted for centuries. And so they have melded together a lot more than what we think about religion here in the West. So Buddhism's success in Asia is in no small part due to its flexibility of its doctrine to, for example, incorporate Shinto gods into its pantheon, to incorporate Taoist schools of thought, things like that. It took the Confucian concept of ancestor worship and added elements of that. Okay. Neo-Confucianism has both Buddhist and Taoist elements, right? So the moral of the story is that these all merge together. And like a lot of Asians wouldn't necessarily understand or recognize that there is a conflict or a discrepancy there, all right? So I'll give you an example. Again, we do mostly Korean martial arts here, so when I was going and studying Asian culture, I put an emphasis on Korean. So I got sick. I was, lived a couple hundred years ago in Korea, and I had a sick child, and I wanted to implore I wanted supernatural intervention for the child, right? So I had a couple routes. I could travel to the Buddhist temple, and I can, invoke my ancestors and the deities there and everything else, and try it and see if they'll make things better, right? You watch Mulan, right? Hopefully the phoenix comes back to my house. That's the new Mulan. Mushu and the old Mulan, right? Whatever, right? But you get, right? So maybe that happens, right? Or I could hire a shaman and do what they called a cook, which was basically a week-long feast and ceremony that involved a feast and basically a party for the village, right? and the shaman comes, and like there's every day, and you gotta host, and now, so which one do you think you want to do? Burn a little incense and go home, or basically basically host a week-long party at your house? Right? I'm gonna go to the temple first. If that doesn't work, maybe now I'll go to the shaman, because the other didn't work. Right? And you're gonna say, well, how can you do? For a lot of people in this country, it is, there's a matter of practicality. They didn't really see a conflict in doctrine or whatever. They were like, maybe they both work. Right? It was a matter of practicality. Right? Just last year when we went to Korea, they were talking. The country has a very high percentage of Christians in the country, but like talking to the tour guide and everything else about kind of what they believe and everything else, their Christianity, I gotta tell you, is a lot different than like our Christianity here. It's a Christianity with thousands of years of Buddhist thinking or other types of thinking is still kind of in there a little bit. And that's not really how we think about it, right? As a Christian, right? That's not how I understand it. Okay, but to them again, they have had this happen. These cultures have intertwined for so long. So we want to keep that in mind. Okay. All right. So the first group or influence we want to look at is Taoism. Okay. And I did not get my board up. So we're going to press pause for a second. I'm going to go grab. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at specifically is Taoism. Right, so Taoism was founded by Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching. Basically, Taoism stresses harmony and nature with the universe. Okay? And so the idea to be in harmony, among other things, is to do as little effort as possible in any endeavor, because it basically is this go with the flow mentality, right? Because to work too hard is to fight against the flow of the universe. Okay? And so we want to struggle is to create conflict, right? And so we want to go with the harmony, and this is just the way it is, and everything else. Okay? And an implication of that, okay, is that we have to be able to react rather spontaneously. Okay? So spontaneity is another big force, because again, you have to take things as they come, right? So spontaneity. We have to be able to take things as they come, because if I'm not, then I'm not really going with the flow. Does that make sense? Okay? So now, how does that influence the martial arts? Well, okay, instead of some martial arts are very much I must dictate terms, right, and impose my strategy on them. But there are other martial arts, and in particular what we call the internal martial arts, or sometimes the soft martial arts. Okay, so the internal martial arts, which is the one that you have heard the most of, is Tai Chi. But again, there's also Xingyi and Bagua. Those are kind of the three big ones. But Tai Chi is the big internal martial art. Okay, and the idea is that you don't resist force coming against you, right? Because that would be struggling. We yield to oncoming force, right? To struggle against that force, right? And so I don't use a lot of effort. I yield to incoming force, and I use the minimal effort in my response. In order to be able to do that, again, I have to be more sensitive and reactionary. I have to be supple and spontaneous. Okay? Because otherwise, then I'm really forcing something. I'm trying to take a square peg and put it into a round hole. Okay? I want to be natural and spontaneous and react. Okay? And now we'll look at spontaneity from a Zen aspect later. Okay, so they tried to get to the same state of mind, right? But this is again Taoism, particularly in China, and how they did it. Okay, you can make the argument that the pacifism, the lack of not to fight at all, is by all means the least amount of struggle possible, right? You can make the argument the extension of pacifism in martial arts or martial arts morality comes from that, okay? But anyway, so like for example, a lot of the things we talk about in Tai Chi, right? Here's a quote: "A master is absolutely enslaved by the demands at our ability. We can always pretend after the fact that we had some say in the matter, but during the event in which our ability is demonstrated, we have no choice about what must be done." In other words, I don't get to choose what happens. You're the one that's applying force on me. I react to it, but what I decide to do, I don't have a choice about what to do. You decide what's going to happen, right? I just react to it and go with it, right? That is Taoist, okay? It's interesting to note that in the martial tradition, and like basically writing goes back to 3000 BC in China, and the Yellow Emperor won battles with martial arts that was taught to him by a Taoist immortal, right? So some of the kind of oldest references to martial arts is tied to Taoism too, okay? Tai Chi is, well, okay, we'll talk about Tai Chi and the internal arts later, right? But Taoism is also more influenced with, is greatly tied to Qigong, which is a sense of health, right? So, Qigong, part of their classes you have to learn how to read my writing, sorry, okay? So, Qigong is a health system that's kind of very Tai Chi-esque. Taoism is tied closely to that, okay? Now, there were parts of Taoism that were I'll call them sects, right? SECTS, of Taoism that were interested in immortality. And through that quest, they developed breathing exercises, deep diaphragmatic breathing exercises that is the foundation of a lot of martial arts breathing today, okay? But it ties to their quest to martial arts, or to immortality. The breath is focused in the Danjin in Chinese, okay? The Danjun in Korean. When we start our kieps here, over there in the lab, when we start doing our kieps, it is the Danjun. It's the center of gravity of the human body, where our chi or ki energy is stored. Okay, it actually means, okay, so Danjun. Okay. Actually, it means cinnabar field, is what it means. I gotta say, I'm not really sure what cinnabar is, okay? But I think it's actually kind of poisonous, but basically it was used in some of these immortal elixirs that these Taoists were using, these potions and whatever to try to reach immortality and everything else, okay? But again, it's where energy is concentrated or whatever. Now, Taoism is also, you can almost make a subset of Taoism. It's in a way a different way of philosophy or whatever. You can look at aspects of these things without necessarily being Taoism, but Taoism is heavily tied to two other things, and that is yin-yang theory and five-element theory. And these two things are very closely related, okay? Everybody kind of has seen the yin-yang symbol, right? The white and the black together, or in Korean it's red and blue, right? So everybody knows the yin yang symbol, and it is positive and negative. The yin is the dark, the yielding, right? Yin, and then the yang is light. Yang is sun, heat, warmth, vitality. It is considered more offensive. Life, things like that is male. Female is yin, dark, cold, death. Just saying. Okay? Right, so, but then you have that duality of yin is defensive, right, versus offensive yang and everything else, okay? And so you have this interplay of yin and yang theory, and so influencing the martial arts, and how do you, the idea of balance, the idea of looking at, so certain things are offensive, certain things are defensive, but if you look at the symbol, right, we all know, right, then you have the little part of each, right, and you'll hear this commonly said, oh, that means there's a little, there's a little yin and yang, and there's a little yang and yin, or whatever else, right? But like basically, there are certain, as we will do, we haven't got to do them over there yet, but there are certain blocks and things that we do that are kind of completely defensive, right? That are, very passive, and they block. Then there are other things that we do that are defensive in nature, but have a little aggression in them, right? So sometimes we just block and we just touch it out of the way. Sometimes, like in Taekwondo, when we block, we are trying to club it, and like we're trying to hit their arm and like practically break their arm when we block. There's a little aggression, there's a little yang in that yin, right? Sometimes when we attack, sometimes we don't want to overexpose ourselves and become, vulnerable to counterattack. So even though it's a yang, even though it's offensive, there's still some yin in it. Okay? It's still got some defense in it. Other times, like it's completely sold out, we are going for broke, it is totally yang. Right? So you can even look at a lot of martial arts techniques like that. Okay? Then there is the 5 element theory. You have 5 elements: fire, water, earth, wood, and metal. That those are tied together, right? And they interact with one another, right? So fire interacts with, obviously water beats fire, but then fire engenders wood because it burns wood, right? And so these work together, and they have a philosophy around them. These two concepts are very important in Chinese medical theory. Okay, so the 5 elements are tied to yin and yang, and so some are yin, some are yang, and then these are tied to Chinese medical theory. Now, Chinese medical theory is also kind of, if that was your science of the human body, okay, if that is how you understood how the human body worked to heal people, the example we used last class, if you're a good mechanic, you can fix things, you can put things together, but that also means you also know how to take things apart, right? If I wanted to be a mean mechanic, right? If I was a good mechanic and I wanted to be mean, I know exactly where to go under your hood and just do a couple little things, and that car's dead, right? I don't have to take a sledgehammer to it, right, or whatever. I know exactly what wires to pull and what screw to undo or whatever, right? Makes sense, okay? Because I know what to fix, I know how to break, right? So martial arts, pressure point theory in particular. I use pressure points as part of my health, as part of my medicine. If I can use it to fix, I also know how to use it to break. Okay? So these two things, and this isn't a class on these concepts, but recognize, again, it's tied to the medicine. If that is my science, and that is how I look at the world and try to define the human body, okay? And people, there's some validity to it, even though it's a very different way of looking at the human body, right? But if that's my science, I'm going to base my fighting system on that science of the day. So it's going to be tied to these concepts, okay? All right. So the next thing we're going to look at is Buddhism. Okay. My hands are going to be really by the time we talk about this. Okay. All right. And in particular, there are many different styles or schools of Buddhism. Okay. The one in particular that we want to focus on is the Chan or Zen sect, okay? Because that is the one that is most tied to the martial arts for a variety of reasons, okay? Zen relies on meditation. It varies from its Indian versions, a couple of different things, okay? There are also two types of ways of looking at so the whole purpose of Buddhism is to gain enlightenment, okay? There are two different schools of thought on how you do that, okay? One is you have to become a monk, spend all your days looking at their scriptures, their study and spend time in meditation and prayer and everything else. It's a lot of work, it's a profession. To gain enlightenment is basically a full-time job. The other school of thought is that enlightenment comes from experience. And you have this epiphany. This light bulb comes on and you're suddenly, through searching out valuable experience, you have these light bulb moments. Okay? Now, if you're a professional warrior, if your job is to be a samurai, for example, which one, and you also want to become enlightened, which school do you think is going to be a little more attractive to you? Well, what's your job? It's not to be a monk, it's to be a warrior. You don't have time to go the scholarly route, right? So from just a practical value, you can see what school of thought was attached to, right, the warrior class. Oh, you mean I can just like have a moment or whatever and then I'm good? Oh, well, that sounds a lot easier to me, right? And because I got stuff to do, right? I got martial arts training, whatever else, right? Make sense? Now, but you see, for example, you hear of different, warriors or whatever going on these pilgrimages where they take on challenges, and it's called Mushashogo. Musashi was the most famous of this. He's a famous martial arts samurai. There's a video, there's movies and everything made about him. He wrote the book Five Rings, which is a famous book, things like that. He's one of the more famous ones that went on these traveling expenditures. Sometimes they did it because they were unemployed and they had nothing better to do. But sometimes, again, they went for that experience for that sake of epiphany and everything else. Okay? Part of that experience is the Eastern way of instruction. Okay? And this ties into the martial arts in a very important way. There's very little instruction, little or no instruction or verbal explanation or guidance. Okay? You kind of mimic and you figure it out on your own. You figure out the intricacies for yourself. I don't teach this way, usually. Okay? But my instructors talk about their instructors would walk out of their office, go up, show a technique, walk up to someone, grab them, throw them on the ground, maybe do it twice, and then walk back into his room. Right? Walk back into his office. And that was your lesson for the day. Your job is then to figure out how that worked. What did he do? And, I hear stories, they would sleep at the school if they didn't have it. If they couldn't figure it out, if they didn't feel like they had it adequately, they would literally spend the night at school. Because the next day, if they came back and they didn't have, what he taught them, then, there was a reckoning. Instructor's mad, you're wasting my time, what, you guys are lazy, whatever else. Okay? Because the idea is this. Through that trial and error, you figure it out. What works, what doesn't work. It's not just spoon-fed to you. You will learn it a lot better if you figure all those things out for yourself. It is the experience of the learning that matters. Okay? That was the premise, that is the idea. That is very different than the Western approach of learning, which is like what we're doing right now. I throw a bunch of information at you and I hope some of it sticks on the wall. Right? That's the Western style of information. If you have questions, you ask. Right? In the Asian way, even Grandmaster Chen, one of my instructors, trained him 20, 30 years. And there'd still be, I could only make so many, I'd want to ask questions, and I get maybe 2 a class at best. I didn't even see them that often, right? But after, later on, I didn't even see them, but when I got, I'm like, hey, I got these questions, what are you talking so much? Well, just train, shut up, train. Right? Figure it out yourself. Right? That's not because the Asian way of looking at things, I'm doing you a disservice if I explain it all to you. It's your job to learn it. Does that make sense? Okay? So that's, again, a very different, and so this is a real conflict, because you have these Asian instructors coming over to teach in America and doing, this is how we learn. And this guy's a butthead. He doesn't explain anything. He doesn't even answer my questions. It's different. Again, there's a real clash there. There's a lot of people who misinterpret when people are learning. One of the ways I do it, and Maya will attest to this, she's been in class, you'll hear it probably later, right? People will come up or will do something in class and they'll go, I keep doing this and this goes wrong or whatever. And I'll look at them yeah, don't do that. And they're like, what if it? I'm like, well, look, you already told me the problem. You recognize this is the problem. Fix it. Don't do that. You already did it. You done all the work, right? You figured out what it was that you're doing wrong.